Hi, welcome to Tradition. My name is Jeff Kastman. I'm your host today, and this is a series of conversations. Thank you for joining us, where we're talking about the traditional Catholic faith, what our ancestors believed, how they lived, how they worshiped. If you have ever had questions about what's going on at the traditional Latin Mass, or why do priests do a certain thing, or why do some Catholics give up meat on Fridays or do other things that appear to be kind of strange to the secular world, you're in the right place. We don't talk about the latest news or gossip on this channel. We talk about things that have always been important to Catholics, things that may have been lost in recent generations as so much of tradition was kind of left by the side of the road as the church marched on towards the new springtime. Today, my guest is Louis Tofari. Louis is the founder of Romanitas Press and a frequent guest here. Welcome, Louis.
Hey, thanks, Jeff.
I'm excited to talk today with you about this topic. It's been in the news lately. It's been on social media. There's been a lot of concern and confusion about, let's just call it the freestanding altar. And this is the result of the new church in St. Mary's, Kansas, built by the Society of St. Pius X, the Immaculata, beautiful new church, one of the largest churches built in the United States in, a decade or two? It's been a long time. And a beautiful church that received a lot of praise, but some people were very upset to find a freestanding altar. And lots of accusations and statements being made about that. And we're going to kind of dive into it. Again, not from the standpoint of what's newsworthy, but rather what's the traditional faith say? What would we find in tradition? And I know you've got a couple of books that you'd like to reference as we're getting started here, but you have a long background in liturgical matters, and you've studied these things very intensely and soberly. And so that's what we're going to talk about today.
I also have, to my credit right now, it's not made the rounds on the internet, so to speak, but I just designed 2 stone altars for the Church of St. Peregrine, just outside of Cleveland. And there's both freestanding altars as well. The main altar is definitely freestanding from the wall by several feet underneath what's called a chivery or column canopy. The other one is actually towards the back of the church. It's more of a side altar, but it's actually separated from the wall by a couple inches. And we'll explain a little bit why. But yes, thank you. So one of my great passions in the liturgy has been the altar, which is only natural because the altar is the very center of the sacrificial liturgy. A book that came to my attention very early on in the mid-90s, quite by accident, I found it in a library, was this book that I ended up reprinting called The Liturgical Altar, which is by a famous architectural historian himself called Geoffrey Webb. He was a British guy, and in fact, he was put in charge of British monuments at one point in the British Empire, well, at least in Great Britain. So he wrote this excellent book. This is the first of 4 that I would recommend. Why I recommend this the most highly out of all of them is because he goes into the supernatural reality of what the altar is for us as Catholics. And therefore, if this is what the altar is and how important it is, how crucial it is, how sacred it is, therefore, these rules as given by the church not only follow, but should be adhered to completely. And one of the unfortunate things is in a lot of our churches, even before Vatican II, as well as in traditional churches today, a lot of these rules do not get followed. Okay, unfortunately, they continue to do some of the same mistakes that were being done in his time. This is a 1948 printing, but this is part of a heritage of a movement to restore the true sense of the altar, which we can talk about briefly. But this is, out of all of them that I recommend right off the bat, the liturgical altar is, in my opinion, the best one for starters, because again, his entire approach is supernatural while covering the prescriptions that go with it.
And you don't have
Okay.
to be a liturgist
No.
or a liturgical geek to read these books, to have interest. In fact, I would say that, part of what we're doing there in liturgy, adoring God and worshiping him, we should also be growing in knowledge and understanding of him. And since the liturgy
Right.
is all pointed to the triune God, studying every aspect of what's happening there, including things like the altar itself, understanding where it's come from and what its role is and why we believe about it. Those are things that should be important to every Catholic. They're probably things that, going back a century or two or more, that all the Catholics knew, right? It was just part of their culture. And we've lost a lot of that.
That's certainly true. And this book definitely this is not a book for clerics. This is a book for everyone. If every Catholic read this book, you would get so much more out of the Mass, because now you truly understand the significance and importance of our altar. And believe it or not, even amongst traditionalists, the importance of the altar is often understated. I know that sounds weird, but it really is. And the only way you're going to be able to understand what I've just said or validate what I've just said is by reading this book, because your mind is just going to explode like, holy cow, I had no idea that the altar encompassed all of this. And anyways, so the
So
next
I gotta admit something, that I'm one of those that really likes what I would call the traditional altar. It's very high in the back, very tall. It's up against the wall. You see this in a lot of churches in the United States. We have a beautiful church here in Nashville, Tennessee. A diocesan church was heavily damaged by a tornado. It had one of these. I've seen those in a lot of traditional chapels and churches. I really like that style. And having grown up in Nova Sordo churches, many of which had been renovated, I see that freestanding altar, and there's a little bit of a shock. But I know you've done the research on this. Would you share with us the original and traditional altars? I know they were freestanding, what their history is. Does it go back to Jewish stuff, pagan stuff? Where does that come from? How far back do we find that practice?
Sure. And before we do that, a couple of the resources. One of these is, we've reprinted recently Peter Anson's classic Churches, Their Plan and Furnishing. And in this book, he gives all kinds of illustrations and everything that he did himself as an artist. And he talks a little bit about the history, development of the altars themselves. There's a lot of fascinating archaeological information about that. But this is a terrific book overall, just about churches in general. So different styles, different forms, the critiques of those things as well. Regarding he also goes into the prescriptions or rubrics and laws surrounding altars. Also, there's a guide for altar and sanctuary. This is a great sidekick to the liturgical altar. They actually reference each other. This actually came out first at the end of the 19th century. Cardinal Vaughan, at that time Archbishop Vaughan of Birmingham, England, ordered that the compilation of all the rubrics or liturgical laws in respect to the altar, and also other things in the sanctuary, different furnishings, the appointments on the altar, be compiled into one single volume. Because before that, yeah, they were all there, scattered around in Latin, okay, or Italian. So what they did was they went and researched it, found all the various documents or decrees on that, and then placed it in here along with a commentary. And the original title of this book, in fact, was Directions for the Use of Architects and Altar Societies. The mundane title today, so that's why I changed it to A Guide for Altar and Sanctuary. People tend to that. But this is a great book as well in that respect. And again, there are even some diagrams and stuff. This is great books for ladies who deal with the altar societies or deal with linens, deal with those kind of things, priests, even the laity, if you want to better understand, gee, what is what are the actual rules? Again, liturgical altar goes through that as well, but they're just great sidekicks to each other. One last book, Candles in the Roman Rite. It's, yes, specifically about candles, but in their use of candles as an appointment on the altar, they also give you these wonderful diagrams, whether they're ink drawings or they even have these beautiful watercolors. And this is really, it was meant to be like a marketing tool for the Gross Candle Company of Baltimore, Maryland, which doesn't exist anymore. But this was also put together by a group of guys who were liturgists and liturgical artists. Okay. And the idea was, this isn't just merely a brochure of types to sell candles. There's an opportunity to show liturgically correct altars and the use of these candles on those types of altars. So that's where this book, Candles in the Roman Rite, really kind of comes in as an inspiration to people, whether, again, you have work in the church as an altar and rosary society, or, you're going to build a church, or you're a priest and you want to make things better, more correct. All these things together help to inform you and inspire you. And so any case, so to go into the ancient form of the altar, we have to go back in time, we have to take our time machine, and we have to go back to before Christianity, where we know, especially through the Old Testament, that all these stone altars that are being erected to make sacrifices to God, that these are constructed out of stone, and that they are obviously freestanding. They're not built up against a wall, and they're always usually outside, okay, because they're burning flesh meat. That's kind of hard to do inside a building. So, we start out with guys like Noah and Abraham and all these, and they're all building stone altars, okay, outside. And then we get the temple, and we start out with the temple in the wilderness, the tabernacle in the wilderness made out of cloth, but the original temple is outside. The original altar of Holocaust is outside in this little courtyard. They have an altar of incense that's made out of wood with gold leaf over it. That's what they burn the incense in, inside the actual tabernacle before the Holy of Holies, which is another partition inside that giant tent, which is what the word tabernacle actually means. And then we get the actual temple built of stone, and you have the same thing going on. The altar of Holocaust out in the court of the priests, and then inside the altar of incense. The pagans, meanwhile, are doing exactly the same thing. The pagans are constructing altars of stone. The ones on which sacrificial victims are being burnt, they're outside the temple. The ones in which there's just incense being burnt, they might be inside the temple, or they may have a libation, something like that, or they're not actually burning, but they're sacrificing, whatever it might be. But the fact of the matter is, in both cases, Jewish, which is commanded by God, pagan, which is a natural outpouring of the natural act of religion. Okay, so they have the idea right, it's just for the wrong way. In both cases, we're using altars that are constructed of stone. And of course, they're freestanding. The concept being that the altar is its own separate thing. Fast forward to Christianity, Jesus Christ is our altar. And the cross, the wood of the cross, as well as the wood of the Last Supper table, become the first altars in a mystical fashion, Jesus Christ being the altar himself. And then, of course, there's a lot of archaeology behind this, but we know that that in addition to the Last Supper table, which a large portion of it's been preserved at St. John Lateran's Basilica, or Archbasilica of the Holy Savior in Rome. This is the bishop's actual cathedral. It's actually exposed to view for most of the year above the main doorway when you walk into the Blessed Sacrament Chapel at St. John Lateran Basilica. But also inside of the high altar in St. John Latern's Basilica is a part or fragments of the wooden altar that St. Peter celebrated Mass on in Rome. There's another fragment of that exists in another church that was considered one of the first churches of the Pope, St. Prudencia, which is where the popes actually lived for a little while. So there's another fragment of that altar. Now they were using wood early on. In the early church, we do know that there were even stone altars. They weren't as common, but they were. Later, with the Constantinian period, once Christianity is legalized, stone altars, by the way, become very quickly legislated for the Roman Church, even before the Edict of Milan of 315 AD. So while they're still in the catacombs, we have at least one pope. It's about 258 AD. He is prescribing the use of stone for altars. Okay. We know that these altars are freestanding because, again, all around them, whether it's Jewish or pagan, this is what's going on. Okay. We start to see with the celebration of Mass over the tombs of the martyrs, yes, it ends up being a little alcove area. And in that sense, they lay a slab there and they celebrate Mass there. But that's just pretty much in the catacombs. We also know apparently there were freestanding altars set up. There's a couple of the catacombs where they actually had larger assembly areas where they were celebrating Mass and they had the altar. And you might say, well, how could they fit that in there? Well, you have to understand in early Christianity, altars are extremely small. I mean, they were the size of a card table, if they were even that size. Again, this is copying pretty much what the pagans are doing. The Jews needed a large altar of Holocaust because they're doing large animals and everything. Well, now we no longer have a bloody sacrifice anymore. By the way, the interesting thing is we Christians, Catholics, we have merged both of those altars together from the old covenant. So the altar of Holocaust, where the sacrifice of the animals actually took place, is now been merged with the altar of incense that was inside the tabernacle, inside the temple. Because now we have an unbloody sacrifice. So they are merged together. If you want to better understand, by the way, some of the significance of the altar, I do have a talk on my website. It's called the Catholic Altar, a Structure for Sanctification. And I explain in detail not only the construction of an altar, but its spiritual significance as well. I go into its rite of consecration, that some of the significance behind that as well. So there's all these resources you can do. Again, all of this will help you to better appreciate the holy sacrifice of the Mass.
Now, Louis, you've given us a great background on what the Jewish practice was, why there were different altars, why they were very large, why maybe they were made out of stone, and what the pagans were doing. But let's face it, once the altar became a Catholic altar, a Christian altar, and there was not a literal fire happening there, and it was happening inside, oftentimes in much more confined places, it was no longer necessary that it be freestanding. Is that when the very elaborate the reredoses and the other decorations began to happen, and why is that not a desirable development?
Well, no. So we may say for at least the first maybe 1,200 years, the freestanding altar was the norm. What happened over time were that altars went from more of a cube shape to being slowly, in our tradition, in the Latin Rite tradition, it began to become more elongated or tomb shaped. In the East to this day, for the most part, they still use a cube. Okay, we began to elongate ours. There were it wasn't merely driven by artistic, it was driven by practicality, because if you understand how our ceremonial actions occur in the Roman tradition, in the Latin tradition, the elongated altar became more and more necessary in that
So
respect.
what you're talking about there for people who maybe are new to the traditional mass, and we welcome you a lot of, that's why we're doing these things, because there's so many people that are new to the liturgy. You're probably asking yourself at times, hey, why are they doing that and what's going on? What Lewis was just talking about was how the priest will move around the altar from the center to the right, from the center to the left, for the various readings of the collects, the epistle side on the right, to the gospel side on the left, and the consecration and offertory actions in the middle.
And
So,
more so, sorry to interrupt you, really it comes from the development of the pontifical form of the Mass, the solemn pontifical form and the solemn. So low Mass ended up imitating those forms by where the priest is going and such. But in reality, they needed this elongated altar as time went on to make those the pontifical, especially the papal form in some respects, more practical to do.
so they would have probably a limited number of altars in any given church or cathedral, and they had to build them to support the pontifical actions, and so thus they, even if they had just one, for example, it would be built to make sure they could support the pontifical functions, which would have.
Yeah, an example, by the way, St. John Lateran's in again Basilica in Rome. It's, if you were to look at that altar is a more of what we call a medieval altar. It's a little newer, so to speak. It's still pretty small, especially now if you go to St. Peter's Basilica, which is one of the ultimate examples of a perfect altar in a cathedral setting, in a basilica setting. It has a very long and very deep rectangular or tomb-shaped altar. So that's because the altar at St. John Lateran's goes back to about the 13th century, if not even a little earlier than that, whereas the one in St. Peter's Basilica is from the early 17th century, okay, or even actually late 16th century. 1500s, 1600s is when it was installed and consecrated. Okay, so what you see is a development in the Roman tradition over time of these altars. And by the way, it's this book again that really goes through and it shows you pictorially that development of the altar.
So let me, you made a comment to me that I want you to address on camera, that a freestanding altar perfectly expresses the concept of an altar.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain that?
Yes. So let's cover real quick. When did these altars placed against the wall or against a screen called a retablo or a reredos, which just means to stand behind? Retablo means to stand behind the table. Reredos just means to stand at the rear behind. Okay. These started to become it was really an artistic fad or style that began to develop in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period. So probably starting around, 1100 AD, maybe even as early. It depends on where you were at. By the way, nothing was uniform back then. And they started to do this at first to give some emphasis to the altar, but also to create, whether they wanted to put some pictorial scene behind it towards the patron saint of the church or something like that. It basically gave artists an excuse to be able to do stuff. And there's some very beautiful, magnificent examples where they did all this. And these retablos or reredos were they could be made of stone, they could be made of wood, they could be made of metal. There were a lot of different things. Then later going on in the 19th century, especially in this country, you see them being done out of plaster, along with plaster altars, which was something that was not done in Europe. Everything was either wood, metal, or marble or stone, okay, of some sort. Plaster's become an American thing, which is we could go into the problems with that later. But anyways, And then what took off was when we had the practice or hallmark of Roman Catholicism, which is exposition of the Blessed Sacrament, the special devotion to the Blessed Sacrament when it's exposed to the faithful for adoration for lengthy periods of time. And these reredos became more and more elaborate, and they started putting thrones into them for the Eucharist because they had taken away the canopy, which is another part of the altar that, was always there traditionally speaking to show the dignity of the altar, the royalty of the altar, the kingship of the altar. But anyways, so this is when all these style of altars start to come into play. Okay, and then they began to connect the altars physically to these back walls or even to the wall of the church, even building them into the wall of the church. And the church has come out and said, look, it's not the ideal. It's not what the historical practice was, the traditional practice was, which was a freestanding altar, which we'll explain why in a minute, but we can tolerate it. Okay, now all that being said, we get into the 19th century and even just prior to the so-called liturgical movement, and there starts to become a movement, you might say, to restore the more ancient form of the altar, which is freestanding with a canopy over it, because they're like, look, we're losing the emphasis of the altar. We're losing this, what the concept, the significance of that altar is. It's just becoming another artistic piece amongst so much other stuff. And so the altar's being swallowed up by this. And the central importance of the altar is now becoming lost, as well as the tabernacle, by the way, because now it's just a couple of metal doors in the wall of the reredos. And it's no longer this special, freestanding, independent, sacred vessel that's connected to the tabernacle. So to go into what is the significance of the altar period. So the altar, a consecrated altar, signifies mystically the body of Christ. We Catholics are all familiar that Jesus Christ is truly present in the Blessed Sacrament, the real presence that's reserved in the tabernacle. But the altar itself represents Jesus Christ. And this is why, by the way, within the liturgy, if the Blessed Sacrament was not reserved on the altar, the celebrant only has to bow to the altar up until the consecration. But everyone else, deacon, subdeacon, acolytes, the laity even, they have to genuflect to the altar because, again, the altar signifies Christ. So you hear about genuflecting the Blessed Sacrament, of course, but there's even the genuflecting to the altar within the context of the liturgy, unless you're the celebrant, because the celebrant is Jesus Christ. Okay, he's alter Christus, in persona Christi is acting. Okay, in the person of Christ he acts.
So let's review that real quick. You're saying that because forgive me, I was raised in the Novus Ordo. I've been involved in tradition for 23 years now, but I thought that we genuflected because our Lord was present in the tabernacle, and at the times when he was not reserved there, that we do not genuflect, like would be Good Friday, Holy Saturday. Could you make that point again in terms of our liturgical actions as it relates to the
in
altar?
respect to the altar? So outside of the liturgy, we only bow to an altar because it signifies Jesus Christ, and also because of the relics that are entombed within. So out of respect, mutual respect for that. And I'm going to go into that aspect in just a moment, which is another layer of the altar, its significance to us. Inside the liturgy, as we say in actu functionis, within the action of the function, now it's a genuflection to the altar. And then once we have the consecration and the sacred species is now present on the altar, it's a genuflection for anybody. By the way, there is a special rule for Good Friday until the vigil of the Easter Vigil, until the vigil of Holy Saturday. the vigil ceremonies. Once the cross is exposed for veneration on Good Friday, which we go up and we kiss that cross, kiss the feet of Jesus, the figure of Jesus. Once that cross has been exposed, it is now a genuflection, specially to that cross for all the rest of Good Friday and all the rest of Easter Vigil up into the ceremonies. There's a very special rule for that that exists. And here we're imitating the ancient ceremony where in Jerusalem on Good Friday, they actually brought out the true cross for veneration. Now, obviously, we're not doing the true cross in most cases, but we're acting as if whatever crucifix is being held before us to venerate is the true cross. And so that true cross would remain exposed for veneration up until the vigil ceremonies. So it's a very, very special rubric that happens only once a year. So basically what they do is they treat all of Good Friday from the exposure of the cross until the Easter Vigil as if you're in the liturgy, even though you're not. But they treat it that way all day long, and then some. Okay. And by the way, it also combines with the fact that Easter Vigil, the Holy Saturday, it's supposed to be a day of the deepest sorrow, because for all of Easter Vigil, we're supposed to be contemplating Jesus in the tomb. And we've left that tomb in sorrow with Our Lady and the holy women and whoever, and St. John and whoever else. Okay. So this is one of those wonderful things that happens with especially with the restored Holy Week, that Holy Saturday now has this emphasis of we're still preparing for when Christ will rise again at midnight.
Can we talk about one of the concerns that people have when they see this freestanding altar? And you've done a great job of giving us the history and the background, the explanation. I appreciate that. And even the reason why let's call it the well-intended or the pious attempts with, the high altar and all of the decoration behind it, why that's not necessarily desirable. But let's face the reality where we are today in 2023 and what's happened in the last 60 years.
Well, first thing I would say is this. Okay, so the freestanding altar is the ideal. That's made very clear by the liturgists. That's made very clear by the practice of the church, the traditional practice of the church. Okay, it's made very clear in the decrees or other prescriptions, or even notes, you might say rubrical notes, that are in all the traditional liturgical books that deal with this. They presume the altar is going to be freestanding. Okay, so this is not a novelty at all. The significance of the altar is so great. Consider this: the primary reason for our church our buildings of the church is the altar. It's the central reason for the altar, because the altar is so sacred to us. It's the most sacred thing to us as Catholics after the Blessed Sacrament. Without an altar, there is no Blessed Sacrament. Without an altar, there is no priesthood. You have to have an altar to have the sacrament, the sacrifice, and the priesthood. They're all interrelated. And the altar takes on another significance because in the traditional practice, going all the way back to the catacombs, celebrating the Mass over the tombs or bodies of the martyrs, and then later they build these enormous churches right over their tombs. St. Peter's Basilica is a giant shrine to the tomb of St. Peter. That's why it exists. St. Peter's Basilica may be the largest church in Christendom. It's not the Pope's Cathedral. St. John Lateran's is. St. Peter's Basilica was built to honor the remains of St. Peter, the apostle. St. Paul outside the walls Basilica was built over the remains of St. Paul the apostle. By the way, both of these have been validated and vindicated by archaeology. There's a clear lineage going all the way back, and from written testimonies from the earliest times, and from oral tradition passed down. So this is really indisputable. Okay. St. Paul was just vindicated just a few years ago. Okay. St. Peter was vindicated definitely under the time of Pius XII and again under Pope Paul VI. Okay. Archaeologically speaking, of course, we've always held this to be the case. Okay. But the communion of saints is another important aspect of the altar, because the altar encapsulates this theological concept of the communion of the saints. Because entombed in the altar are relics specifically of martyrs, can be of other saints as well, but it's got to be first-class relics. That is like a bone of a martyr, at least one, but preferably two martyrs have to be entombed inside the altar. And it's the blood of the martyrs, that's really important because they're intricately connected to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. It also goes back to the prophecy or vision of St. John, the apostle, the evangelist, in his Apocrypha, not the Apocrypha, the Apocalypse, or Book of Revelations, as some like to say. The Apocalypse, he says, I saw under the altar of God those who were slain for the word, Jesus Christ. So he sees this in the heavenly liturgy, which we've now replicated in our liturgy. By the way, both in the West and the East, the placement of relics inside the altar is this ancient tradition. And in fact, again, going back to the catacomb period, before even Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, there's a pope who already states that Mass must be celebrated over the relics of the martyrs, the remains of the martyrs. And we've been doing this ever since. Okay. So inside the altar, we have this great connection with our great friends in heaven, church militant. And they are there with us during the act of the holy sacrifice of the Mass or other acts of the divine liturgy that take place around the altar in the sanctuary. Okay. So we have this great communion of the saints. We are there as church militant, they are there as church triumphant. And you might say in the ethosphere, we have church suffering. They're not there per se, but we remember them during the Mass. They're united to us, at least in spirit, if not there in a supernatural way, because they're not able to communicate that way being in purgatory. Okay, whatever. But there's an enormous significance to the altar. So the question comes down to, when we start adding stuff to the altar that diminishes the visual focus of the altar and even the practicality of the use of the altar, we now begin to diminish the importance of the altar. So there's nothing wrong with having a reredos behind your altar, okay? But there's also better ways to design these things or to even decorate the altar in such a way that it still stands out as, look, the altar is not just a form or a box that happened to be included with this giant altar piece. And sometimes that's unfortunately what you see. It's like you walk in the church, you see this huge, enormous thing with all these statues and angels and niches and who knows what. And it's like, well, where's the altar? Oh, I can barely kind of see it outlined there. Okay. And what does that do to the altar? And what does it do to the actions of the sacrifice of the Mass? It relegates those only secondarily in importance to this giant artistic thing. And this is why you got someone like Jeffrey Webb in the liturgical altar who says, look, artistically, some of these things are very beautiful, but liturgically, not so much. Because again, what does the church exist for? What does the sanctuary exist for? What does the altar exist for? The altar is the stone of sacrifice. It is the first and primary importance. Everything else is secondary or tertiary. And unfortunately, a lot of times, it's like you hear about revocations of these churches that have occurred. And you hear about the litany or laundry list of things that they detrimentally did to these churches. But the funny thing is, I've heard these lists being repeated over and over again, from whether it was in the late 1960s, 70s, 80s, and even into now. And almost always, the first thing I hear on their list is statues. They got rid of our statues. And now by number 5, oh, they got rid of the altar. Or they changed this with the altar. But it's like, why didn't you mention the altar first? Why wasn't the altar a first place, a first significance? Or the baptistry, which is second in importance to the high altar, by the way. But you almost never, I mean, the baptistry is like, oh yeah, that's right. And they did this to the baptistry and took the font and did this and that or whatever. But I mean, and I don't blame a lot of Catholics for not understanding the primary, you know, what has primary importance: altar, baptistry, this, because unfortunately, artistically, especially in the United States, what you were describing earlier, Jeff, your typical neo-Gothic church in America, which has been replicated or photocopied over and over and over again, this is what most American Catholics are kind of accustomed to. And they're used to these giant reredos, and the altar's just kind of stuck there, and the tabernacle stuck there, and you might see the 2 golden doors. But then they go to Europe, and they're like, whoa. They go especially to churches in Rome, the basilicas in Rome, the major basilicas, the minor basilicas, and they're set. Why is the altar so far away from the wall? Why is there this giant canopy over it? Or, you know, and they're like, they're culturally shocked because I'm not, I mean, there are examples of these in the United States. I just helped to design one, and one that was built. We just had the one in St. Mary's, Kansas, that was just built, which has received a lot of controversy. But, and there are other examples in the United States. National Basilica in Washington, D.C., which is a superb example of a church, a very, very well-built church, one of my favorites in the United States of America. Okay, so there are lots of other examples that do exist in the United States, but unfortunately, they're not as common as some of us would really like to see. Okay, because they're exemplary forms or representations of really what not just merely the altar, but even what the sanctuary used to be. Unfortunately, a lot of American Catholics are used to a devotional style sanctuary. You have the kneeling, adoring angels on each side, and you have this and that. It's like, none of that stuff is, if you go to Europe, you don't find that for the most part, especially the older churches. You will not find any of these kneeling, adoring angels on each side or all this. You don't find that. Why? Because they're not really part of a sanctuary. There's stuff that were invented by American artisans, and they've become part and parcel to the typical neo-Gothic wedding cake altar, as I like to call them.
Now, if you go to Latin America, from Mexico to Argentina, you will find a lot of those things, and they long predate the United States. So what's going on there? Is that just a reflection of the Spanish and Portuguese export of what was contemporary in the 16th century or whatever? Is that what you're saying?
And what you see in Spain and in Portugal, and there's some for instance, in Toledo, in the cathedral, you have this incredibly I think the thing's at least 30, it's probably 45 feet tall. It's a stone carved reredos with, I mean, multiple statues in it. It's very, very nice. It's very, very beautiful. And they have a stone altar. And so you see this where they develop their own Gothic style. This was also very common in England, especially too. The difference was when they built these, they would vest the altar in color. So I often tell people, yes, you may have this neo-Gothic reredos thing, and it's all made out of plaster, or maybe it's carved wood, possibly it's marble, and the altar just tends to blend right in. Well, the way you solve it is by vesting the altar with an antependium, which is, or frontal, altar frontal, which was the traditional practice. You can see pictorial or artistic representations, paintings, murals, carvings of altars and sanctuaries from the earliest ones we have all the way up into the Renaissance period and a little beyond. The altar is always fully vested in royal vesture and clothing and garb, just like the priest. And I know you get some people, oh, but we have a beautiful, magnificent carving of the Last Supper on our altar. And why would we want to cover that up? Because it's Jesus Christ. Technically, the only time it's nude is from Holy Thursday, stripping of the altar, until the Easter Vigil. Okay. Also, I want to point this out. Those Last Supper scenes you see on our altars, that was started by Martin Luther. Not started by Catholics, because the idea is that he wanted the connection of, well, it's just a meal. It's not really a sacrifice, as the Catholics believe. It's just a memorial meal. Now, I'm not condemning those Last Supper scenes. I'm just putting it in perspective. Look, if the altar is Jesus Christ, if it's his body, just like we're supposed to veil the tabernacle to show the great mystery, we're supposed to veil the entire tabernacle, by the way, on all sides. That shows the great mystery and the reality of the real presence of Jesus Christ. Just like the Ark of the Covenant was covered in the tabernacle, or Holy of Holies, the temple with a giant veil, we do the same thing. The altar itself was intended to be veiled to show, again, that is Jesus Christ mystically. That is the altar of sacrifice. It is super sacred to us. To get back artistically, when you do this to your altar, now, even if it's part of a reredos, it stands out. And that's perfectly fine. And that's what I tell people to do. If you want your altar, you want to give your altar the emphasis that it really should have, put an antipendium on it. Because in fact, that is really the official practice of the church. Is it tolerated not to have one on there? To some degree, yes. By the way, the ceremonial books presume that for greater festivities, the altar will always be vested. Okay. So again, you read books like this, he goes into this with the importance of the frontal or antipendium. You know, why is it so important to do this to our altars? And why was this always being done? You know, we're talking about a 15, 16, 1700 year period. Even the earliest Christian altars, we have representations where they were veiled. They were veiled, whether it was a type of drop cloth, like a tablecloth, that eventually developed into what we have later today. Again, they go into that with these kind of books, where they actually show you, because we actually have mosaics and paintings that go all the way back to the 7th century. And you see that on there.
I can certainly see, you know, if I were a serious Protestant and I had read some great Catholic works on the nature of the sacrifice, on the consecration at the Mass, the transubstantiation, all of these things, and that was helping to bring me to the Catholic faith and to the Catholic liturgy. I can certainly see how walking into a well-designed church and seeing that altar there that might be reminiscent of what, you know, the sacrifice, that, you know, the altar of Holocaust,
Right.
I can see how that would make sense.
Right.
Let's
They do
face
get
it,
that.
let's face it, today, for people in the United States, most of our listeners, Catholics in the United States, they're probably less than 70 years old on average. What they see is versus populum. Can you address that issue? I mean, it's just the reality, right? They see the freestanding altar and they think, oh, that's what it's all about. It's about the presider who's going to, you know, perform for us.
Right. So I need to explain. We have the ad orientem, which means towards the east, or versus populum, turn towards the people. So there is a raging battle about this now. And there's a lot of unfortunate misunderstandings, misconceptions, damning dogmatic statements by some people who really don't know any of the history of what's going on. So let me, in a brief nutshell,
we've had, you know, quite a rash of excommunications and declarations of
interdicts,
too. Yeah, interdicts in place, lay interdicts in place lately as well.
So let's explain that there is, like many things, there is a absolute distinction between traditional modes of certain things that people unfortunately have associated commonplace with the Novus Ordo Missae. And there is a diametrical difference between these concepts. Mass facing the people, or the freestanding altar, happens to be one of them. There are many others, Jeff, that you and I could discuss at some other time, but let's just discuss this. So the first thing is, we know that the freestanding altar definitely is traditional. It goes back to the apostolic age, that this was in fact the norm of the shape or form of the altar for, at least 1,000 years and going more. And even after, once the medieval period, they start building reredos and stuff. Nevertheless, freestanding altars continue to be built. Okay, this is an indisputable historical fact. What comes in around the 19th century, the late 19th century, you have a lot of archaeological research being done into the liturgy. A lot of new texts are being found. There's a great interest in the history of the liturgy, and in many different ways, from the development of our churches, of our altars, of the use of candles, of the vestments, of the texts of the Mass, the different rites of the Mass. It's every single level of the liturgy is being explored, and a great interest is being taken in. One of the things that's being done is an exploration into a better understanding of the unique structure or layout of the Roman basilicas. Now, oftentimes it's called a basilica style or confessio style. Basically, what you have a high altar. It's got a canopy or chivery. I know a lot of people call it a baldacchino. Technically, it's not a baldacchino. It's technically called a chivery. Okay, I know everyone at St. Peter's Basilica calls that enormous bronze Barini chivery. They call it a baldacchino, and from the Italian. But anyways, he goes in and explains the different types of canopies that do exist. So it's technically a chivery. Okay, Civory, if you want to know, chivery. And in front of that altar is what is an area that's been excavated. And you can go down there, and there's an altar down there, or something of some sort, called a confessio, or you can reach in there to see the saints' relics. Okay, and this altar is usually built in such a way, the only way you can celebrate Mass is by facing down the nave. So you don't have your back to the faithful. Okay, you actually are in a sense facing the faithful. But if you've ever seen pictures of the papal Mass, especially of Pius XII, there's so much stuff on that altar, and the stuff is so big, you really can't even see the Pope. Okay. So what's happening here is these archaeologists are seeing this pattern of these basilicas in Rome being repeated over and over and over again. So they come up with the conclusion that this must date back to the apostolic tradition, and they must have been celebrating Mass facing the people. And then eventually they got turned around. To make a long story short, turned out that what was happening in Rome is they were copying the pattern that was unique to St. Peter's Basilica. And St. Peter's Basilica was doing it a certain way because in order to face east, or ad orientem, this was extremely important to the early church and even to today, to celebrate Mass facing east, because east is facing symbolically the parousia. Parousia is Greek for the second coming. We have always typically symbolically faced east since apostolic times, because Jesus Christ is supposed to return during the celebration of the Mass, coming from the east. He also represents the rising sun, which comes from the east, rises from the east, sets in the west. The east also symbolizes the heavenly Jerusalem. So this eastward orientation, ad orientem, that's where the word orientation even comes from, even the Orient, it means the east, okay? Asia Minor, all those areas. It's been highly symbolic for the church since apostolic times. It's no longer prescribed that our churches have to face east, but ideally we want them to. Well, at St. Peter's Basilica, because of the way that they built the church on top of Nero's circus, they, in the cemetery where it was, in order to make it fit, they had to build the church so actually the Pope would end up facing west if he was actually having his back to the faithful, the nave of the church. So what they did was they had him face down the nave, and which faced eastward. Now, what was not well known at the time of the late 19th century, when they're saying, aha, so it must have been mass facing the people since apostolic times, as found repeatedly seen in these Roman basilicas, and some other examples as well, which it turns they're just copying each other. What they weren't aware was that in the sacramentaries, so these are the old altar missal books, they weren't called missals yet, they were called sacramentaries, and also some of the other rubrical texts that we had, like called the ordines, there was a direction, just like, so we know that the deacon would chant ite missa est to the catechumens, saying, go, it is the dismissal, because they could not stay for the sacred mysteries because they had not been initiated by baptism yet to witness those. So they were not allowed to take part in the consecration. They weren't allowed to see the sacred mysteries yet until they had been baptized. So they had to depart the church. That's why we have the liturgy of the catechumens, and then we have the sacrificial liturgy or liturgy of the Eucharist, because the liturgy of the catechumens were there for their instruction, and then they had to leave. Well, the deacon also had another role, or one of the deacons, that is, and his role was to tell the faithful at certain times of the Mass, turn to the east. Basically something like conversum ad orientem, okay, is what he would chant. And everyone would turn in St. Peter's Basilica, and they would face east. They had their back to the altar. This is during some of the most sacred parts of the Mass, like the collect, and even during the consecration, because there was no elevation back then, by the way. All right, like we're used to today in the early papal liturgy. All right, and so eventually, so you see the enormous significance of placing on ad orientem and facing the east. Okay, this is a very particular practice. That was a papal practice, and then eventually that rubric dies out, and the faithful just stay facing the altar. So now, another element to this, the liturgical movement begins to gather steam as of the early 20th century. And one of the problems that are being faced is, how do we get Catholics to take a greater interest, appreciation, and participation in the sacred Mass? And one of the problems they saw is, first thing, they're having low Mass all the time instead of more sung Masses. So they're trying to solve that, by the way. That's one of the number one things of the liturgical goals of the liturgical movement, is restore to Sundays the sung Mass. So it wasn't just as quickly said low Mass, it's actually sung Mass with Gregorian chant, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that they see is, well, if we have, based on what these archaeologists have said, if we have historical proof that Mass was once said facing the people, and then eventually it was changed around, why couldn't we, for pastoral reasons, restore this? Because then if the people can see what the priest is doing at the altar, they'll take a greater interest. They'll actually start to see and watch what he's doing instead of burying themselves in their private devotions. And they'll now better unite themselves with the sacred liturgy and participate in it. And this and forth will sanctify them better, and this and forth will sanctify society. So this is a big, giant goal. So they're thinking, we have this proof behind us to initiate this. Now, by the way, if you read all the early liturgists who are promoting this view, this concept, this pastoral concept, is completely theologically orthodox. It's not modernism. There's some limited experimentation that is approved to give to that. One of the quote unquote infamous books people like to cite is The Mass of the Future, by Father Ellard, which, by the way, St. Mary's, Kansas, that's where he wrote this book. He was a Jesuit, and that's where he was stationed, the very place where we're talking about this church. But really what they're doing is they're talking about what can we do to make the liturgy not so much relevant like we think of today, but to make it relevant from what can we do to get them to take a greater interest. None of these things being espoused at that time, for the most part, is some kind of modernism, humanist agenda, ecumenism with the Protestants. You'll see this over and over again. This is one of the great misconceptions or misunderstandings that people will dogmatically start talking about out of their, that they don't know. They'll accuse these guys of being modernists right off the bat just because it's mass facing the people or it's a freestanding altar. Like, read what they actually have to say. Read what they're trying to accomplish. Okay. Yes, later we discover it's a historical fallacy of mass facing the people going from apostolic times. And here's another reason why it's an historical fallacy. Not only one, the apostles themselves would have not done something so radical as to depart from not only what they saw the Jews doing, but what the pagans doing, which is a natural act of religion. Not even the early Protestants did that, by the way. They even continued with ad orientem, like the Lutherans and Episcopalians, okay? It wasn't until much, much later in their, we might say the 20th century, that they start this idea of man-centered liturgy. I mean, really, you start with the Calvinists. Okay, you start with the Calvinists. They began a little bit earlier. Okay, I think as early as the 18th century is when they began doing this idea. Okay, they don't even have an altar anymore. It's a communion service, and it's mostly done from the pulpit with the pastor or minister facing the people and leading them in sermons and songs and stuff. Okay, so you even have guys like Jeffrey Webb in the liturgical altar when this book was originally written that are I shouldn't say falling, but are beholden to this, what they thought had historical weight behind it of the freestanding altar, mass facing the people, going back to apostolic times. There's another reason why this is a fallacy. I don't know of any major religion, true or false, that's ever had a liturgy or service where man faced man. It was always man faced as deity, always. Okay. So in all the established religions, major religions, that was always the case in some shape or form, whether it was the Jews, different types of pagans all over the world. You see this natural act of religion. Okay. Obviously, the special case of St. Peter's Basilica is something else that's going on that's very unique to that building. Okay. Which eventually got copied throughout this city of Rome and other places as well. But anyways, so the first attempts for mass facing the people has an actual Orthodox concept behind it. And for those who say that could never be, I would like to point to the famous video, The Last Mass of Padre Pio. He is facing the people, saying the traditional mass. The reason they turned it around or established a freestanding altar and him facing them is so the people could be edified by watching Padre Pio celebrating mass. Okay, so it's not all an entire and always a humanistic thing. What ends up happening is, yes, there are a lot of guys in the liturgical movement who are big promoters of mass facing the people. But initially, it's all for this pastoral idea. It's only later, with the development of the new mass, which of course has an ecumenical foundation, has 6 Protestant ministers who are intricately working together with the concilium to create this new liturgy. Now this concept of insisting on a freestanding altar for to enable mass facing the people becomes this humanistic Protestant ecumenical agenda. And that's the great distinction that's got to be made there, is that in the context of the traditional liturgy, you don't really see that humanistic agenda being proposed. Okay. It's not until you get the concilium when ecumenism becomes their goal. And humanism, by the way, Pope Paul VI emphasizing, I want a man-centered liturgy. Okay, like the Calvinists. I mean, he said that I want a Calvinist style mass. What is a Calvinist style mass? It's man-centered. That's what it is. And he even said, it's like, we're worried more about man than we are about God. I'm paraphrasing here what he said, but he started this whole concept. So there's an absolute diametrical difference of emphasis of the versus populum of the liturgical movement in the beginning versus that of the Novus Ordo Missae, and they are opposed to each other. And even though you have the same liturgists that began with an orthodox idea that transitioned to an ecumenical idea, or they may have continued doing it, they still thought there's a pastoral advantage. They weren't looking at it humanistically. So you remember, by the way, there are a lot of guys that are part of the liturgical movement, and they transition over into the concilium. They're still promoting some of their orthodox ideas, but unfortunately, their concept might be orthodox. But the main guys like Annibale Buonini, they're going to say, I'm going to take this, hijack it, and use it my way, the humanistic Protestant way. He may be still thinking about it in orthodox terms of, I want a pastoral advantage so people can take more from the liturgy. But his thing is, I want to create this humanistic Protestant-sized liturgy, as Pope Paul VI wants. And I myself have now been convinced we should do. So again, it's really important, distinction, not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and not to put everybody in the same basket as well, too. Because again, even some of these guys are part of the liturgical movement. When they saw what came out with the Novus Ordo, they were disgusted. They were like, well, what can I do? At that point, you might say should have been more strenuous. I mean, Father Louis Boyer is probably one of the most strenuous objectors because he resigned his commission on the concilium, because he saw you're not being in line with tradition anymore. And he told this to Pope Paul VI. So, you've got these guys who are, really confused. There are many other liturgists that I could cite as well, who are not happy with what came out from the concilium. But unfortunately, people include them with the really bad guys. Okay. And there are some guys who went along with it because of the hubris, and that's unfortunate. I mean, so again, when we're dealing with, first thing, the liturgical movement, what is completely valid, legitimate goals are, and then it's hijacked by the concilium, by the Novus Ordo Missae. You've got to make an absolute distinction. There's a line drawn in the sand where it goes from this is all good, or regarding the pastoral idea of mass facing the people. Does it work?
Yeah.
You could argue limitedly, maybe, but does it ultimately work? I would say no. That means you should not just condemn it out of hand by saying anytime you'd ever see mass facing the people being done before, the new mass, oh, that's heretical and that's the beginning of the end. And I was like, well, then what do you say about Padre Pio? Padre Pio did it willingly. He didn't protest and say, no, I will not do this. He saw no problem with it. We know this for a fact. So the question, by the way, we know Archbishop Lefebvre even offered the traditional mass at least once in mass facing the people. He was a superior general traveling around, and I believe it was the Columbia, and he did it. Okay. So again, it's all proper distinction and context of what's going on. Okay. So it's not correct to say mass facing the people is always wrong. Okay. With proper distinctions being made. Is it really the ideal? And I would say no.
Let's talk about one final thing. We're running a little long, but one of the other issues that people have with the freestanding altars is the fact that the tabernacle is disconnected from the altar. Perhaps it's behind it, maybe it's off to the side somewhere. You shared with me something from Pope Pius XII. I don't know if you want to mention that as we're wrapping up, but when we see these freestanding altars, there's oftentimes that disconnect. Can you talk about that briefly?
Yeah. So by the way, regarding the altar in question at the Immaculata Church, the tabernacle is on it. The tabernacle is supposed to be on it. Just because it's freestanding doesn't mean you don't place the tabernacle on it. Okay. And the freestanding altar actually allows you to go and incense it all the way around. The freestanding altar allows the tabernacle to be properly veiled, completely enveloped. So I know a lot of people are used to the tabernacle curtains that hang in front, and technically those do not fulfill the prescription to veil the entire tabernacle. Okay. Technically it's supposed to be completely covered, what's called a canopéum. That's the Greek term for that fully enveloped veil. Okay. So the freestanding altar does not preclude by any way the tabernacle. The tabernacle, but Pius XII taught that the tabernacle and the altar are considered to be united together. The altar of the sacrament should be united to the altar of sacrifice from which it comes. And it's supposed to be technically secured. I mean, so it should not just be sitting on there. It literally should be, whether it's bolted down to the altar so you can't pick it up and walk away with it, which is happening now because people are restoring the tabernacle now back to center of churches, but they're not bolting it down. So yes, you have in some cases where the tabernacle is now being restored back to the central location of the church, but because it's in the context of the Novus Ordo, they're still not placing it on the altar. They're putting it on like a pedestal or another altar behind the main altar, and they're putting it there. What the traditional concept was that the tabernacle is always on an altar. So and whether it's a freestanding altar or not, it doesn't make a difference. So there are lots of examples, even in the United States, pre-Vatican II, where you have the tabernacle secured to a freestanding altar. Okay. There are other examples. The one I just helped out is Cleveland. St. Vincent de Paul Church in Kansas City, Missouri is a magnificent example where they have a freestanding altar and the tabernacle is on it without anything. Okay. Again, the Immaculata, there are many St. Mary of the Assumption Church in St. Louis, Missouri, another Society of St. Pius X Chapel. Tabernacle is right there on a freestanding altar. Okay. So there's lots of examples. So unfortunately, people are using as their experience and therefore as their proof is, not necessarily 100% traditional, or they'll even say, well, I went into such and such a cathedral and the tabernacle wasn't on the high altar. It was in a different chapel. Well, actually in the cathedral, that is the case. In the cathedral, by law, the tabernacle is not supposed to be on the high altar. Tabernacle is supposed to be in a special chapel devoted to the Blessed Sacrament with its own altar. So the tabernacle was on an altar in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. The perfect example of this is the magnificent Blessed Sacrament Chapel of St. John Lateran's Basilica, okay, which is enormous tabernacle on a giant freestanding altar. Anyone's ever, just Google it, okay? And that's where by the way, you have enshrined the Last Supper table up there as well, above the doorway to go in. But just Google it. But you'll see that this is a magnificent example. So unfortunately, a lot of people, again, they're conflating the freestanding altar with Novus Ordo, which is not at all. They're conflating also versus populum with the Novus Ordo. We could say there's a lot of other things that conflate with the Novus Ordo that are technically true. So unfortunately, as a result of that, whenever they see anything like this, there's a knee-jerk reaction. And they're not making these proper distinctions. Again, I will promote the freestanding altar that should be done in the proper way. I am not promoting Mass facing the people, but I would say, look, the traditional Mass facing the people has a completely different nuance than what we see in the Novus Ordo, okay, in that respect. All right. So that's it. I just want to make that distinction there that look, per se, mass facing the people is not evil incarnate. Okay, just like per se, the freestanding altar is not modernist. Okay, we need to be very, very clear. And it's very important that we traditional Catholics make these critical distinctions, and we don't just throw out baby with the bathwater and start making all kinds of dogmatic statements on Facebook, of which we know nothing about.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly we have a problem because of the crisis. And because there's so much inaction and negligence on the part of clergy. There's, well-intended, passionate people have a tendency to kind of try and fill that vacuum. And certainly we'll want to avoid that and remain conscious of our duties according to our state in life. We've covered a lot of ground here about altars and all the related topics. As we wrap up, is there anything you want to cover as a final point?
I think it's important, again, that we Catholics, we have this opportunity to, especially in the midst of the crisis, to try to learn more about these things. It's unfortunate, and I don't wish to condemn our ancestors, but it's unfortunate that maybe perhaps they didn't take a greater interest in these things, or that they helped support the very same restorations, reforms, or revisions that these kind of guys were trying to do through educating themselves to better understand why is it important that we really restore the more ideal form of the altar. Because to be honest, it's my opinion that partly what led to, you might say in some ways, the wholesale destruction of a lot of our sanctuaries is because there was an overreaction from people who were just sick and tired of seeing, sanctuaries that really did not adequately express the liturgical ideal, and they went overboard. But you can understand that, where they were just like, enough's enough. Let me get rid of the sappy art. Let me get rid of the, the bad examples. But unfortunately, again, they went overboard in many, many cases. In the majority of cases, they went overboard. But the thing is also, we have the opportunity to restore what is more ideal, what is more correct, rather than say, oh, we just want to see what was in this picture from 1890. Yeah, well, there's a problem with what's in that picture in 1890. Okay, let me go through the litany with you, okay, of things that are a problem. But unfortunately, people say, but that's so beautiful, that's so wonderful, that must be the ideal. We've seen that repeated over and over again, the wedding cake altar and the kneeling adoring angels and all the statues in the sanctuary on these pedestals, and that must be what's right. And I was like, no, it's not. And this is why you've got to educate yourself on, why does the altar exist? Why does the sanctuary exist? Why does the church exist? What is the order of precedence of importance? And in that respect, the Immaculata Church has done a relatively good job in helping to implement many of that, those actual principles. And I know they've received some critique for that. Myself, I wish they had placed a chivery over the high altar. They could still do it if they want to. So who knows? But in itself, there's definitely been a lot of good work that's gone into that. And definitely, some people are shocked because it's not what they expected as a traditional church. I'm like, it's completely traditional. To go into basilicas in Rome, you would see something very similar. Okay. And those are not Novus Ordo. Okay. So I think that's why education through reading of actual resources is so important, to educate ourselves. And we have this opportunity to better educate ourselves. I mean, one of my missions at Romanitas Press, this is one of the very first things I ever made available. And I've been carrying it ever since. I've sold hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of copies of the Liturgical Altar to anybody you can imagine. It's a book I think every Catholic should have on their bookshelf. people go back to this all the time. I have priests who read this. They're like, wow, after I read this book, it actually helped my priesthood. Because now when I step up to that altar, I have a better appreciation of what that altar means for me as a priest. And you'd think priests would know, but sometimes you got to read about it to better appreciate it. And we, like I said, we have this great opportunity to educate ourselves. These resources are now more readily available than they were before, especially to the laity. By the way, this makes a great apologetical handout. If you got a priest, you want to get them to start better understanding tradition or make an unrenovation in their sanctuary, give this to them. This has converted many priests, or even in tradition, priests are like, well, I don't really see the necessity for an antependium for veiling our altar. It's already beautiful. Well, read this. And I've had priests who said, you know, I was against doing an antependium on our marble altar because I thought it was beautiful. And then I read this and I saw, gee, symbolically, it's more important to veil the altar. And now I'm convinced, and now I want to do it. But so I'm just, you know, again, let's not just be satisfied with what was being done before Vatican II, because a lot of that stuff that was being done practically, physically, wasn't always the best way. So anyways, so to take away with it also, more importantly, it's a book like this that help further deepen and increase your spiritual awareness of not just merely of that object, the altar, but therefore its role in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Okay, and therefore also why is our adherence, our conviction concerning the traditional Roman Mass so important? Well, it comes to the faith. How does the altar encompass those articles of faith? And this book explains it. So,
Louis, thank you for your time today and your sharing your extensive knowledge about this topic. How can people reach you? romanitaspress.com?
yes, or info@romanitaspress.com. You know, for any hate mail, you know, that we, you know, you're a modernist, whatever. Okay. I'm happy to have conversations with people on these topics, because I think it's so important we make proper distinctions.
Absolutely. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for your time and sharing your experience and your insights. And the books, we'll put all of those resources in the show notes below, so you'll be able to find those easily, people. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being with us. If you've liked what we're doing here, please like and share. Put it on social media, share with your friends. There's no grifting here. There are no donations. There's no supporters. It's just we're contributing our time, trying to help share the richness and the truth about Catholic tradition. If you don't like what we're doing here, Louis gave you his email. Please let him know how you feel.
Jeff,
All
you
right.
sound like you want to. It sounds like you want to exit out through the back door when it comes to, you know,
As always.
controversy.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. God bless you. Please pray for us and have a great day.
Thank you.